Evelina Marsh saw her own name printed between a broken carriage and a set of silver spoons. The newspaper was folded on the kitchen table, left there by a maid who had laughed before she realized what she was reading. Evelina picked it up with wet hands, still smelling of soap from washing the morning dishes, and read the words twice because the first time her mind refused to accept them. For sale, estate contents of Ashcombe House. Furniture, horses, silverware, and the hand of Miss Evelina Marsh in marriage to a suitable buyer of good standing. She read it a third time. The letters did not change. Her chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a rope around her ribs and pulled it slowly, patiently, enjoying the process. She set the paper down and picked it up again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less cruel. They did not. She walked through the halls of Ashcombe House with the paper still in her hand, past portraits of relatives who had never once looked at her the way a family should, past the tall windows that let in gray light instead of warmth, until she reached her father's study. The door was closed. She did not knock. She had stopped knocking 3 years ago, around the same time she had stopped expecting him to look up when she entered a room. He was seated behind his desk, a glass of something amber in front of him, papers scattered like he had been arguing with numbers all morning and losing. "Father," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What is this?" He looked at the paper in her hand without much surprise, which told her everything she needed to know. He had expected her to find it. He had simply hoped it would be later, when there was less time to argue, when the arrangement was closer to finished. "Sit down, Evelina." "I would rather stand." "Sit down," he said again, and this time it was not a request. She did not sit. She stood there, arms crossed, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of what she had read, though some part of her already understood there was no explanation that could. Her father exhaled long and slow, the way he did when he was preparing to say something he knew was indefensible. "There are debts," he said. "You know this. You have known this for months." "I know about the debts. I did not know I was one of the assets." "Do not be dramatic." "I am reading my own name in a sale advertisement, Father. I think dramatic is the reasonable response." He rubbed his eyes, and for a moment he looked old in a way she had never quite noticed before, old and tired and cornered, and some small foolish part of her almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "The house is going to be seized within the month if I cannot settle what I owe," he said. "Everything I have built, everything your grandfather built before me gone. I have no more furniture to sell that would cover it. I have no more land I can part with without losing the title entirely. So you decided to sell me instead." "I decided," he said, his voice hardening now defensive, "to arrange a marriage that would solve 2 problems at once. You need a husband eventually, Evelina. Every woman of your standing does. I have simply expedited the matter by listing me next to a broken carriage." He winced at that at least, which was something. "The wording was poorly chosen," he admitted. "The man handling the advertisement took some liberties. That is not the point. The point is that within the month, someone respectable will come to inspect the estate, and you will be part of what they consider. Like a horse. Do not be crude." "I am not being crude, Father. I am being accurate." He stood then, palms flat on the desk, and for a moment she thought he might actually raise his voice, might actually show some flicker of the temper she knew lived under his careful exterior. Instead, he simply looked at her, and his expression was worse than anger. It was resignation. He had already decided this was happening, and her feelings about it were, to him, a formality to be endured rather than a concern to be addressed. "You will understand one day," he said quietly, "that some choices are not really choices at all. They are simply what remains." She left the study without another word, because there was nothing left to say that he would actually hear. The rest of that day passed in a strange, hollow blur. She went about her usual duties, checking on the household accounts, speaking with the cook about the week's meals, because someone had to keep the house functioning even while it was being sold out from under her. But her mind kept circling back to the same image, over and over, her name printed in ink next to a description of silverware, as though she were an object with a price rather than a person with a future. By evening, word had already begun to travel. A stable boy mentioned, quite innocently, that a gentleman had written ahead to say he would arrive the following day to inspect the horses. Evelina felt her stomach drop. The horses. Of course. Someone was coming to look at the horses, and she was apparently included in the same visit, another item on the same list. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind move through the old house, and she thought about running, actually running, taking whatever coins she had saved and disappearing into the countryside before any buyer arrived to inspect her like livestock. But she knew, even as she thought it, that she had nowhere to go. No family beyond this house who would take her in. No money that would last more than a few days. Running was a fantasy for people who had somewhere to run to. Morning came gray and cold, fitting for the mood that had settled over the house. Evelina dressed carefully, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she refused to look like exactly what her father had made her out to be. She would not walk into this day looking sold. She was in the east garden, cutting flowers for the dining table out of habit rather than any real desire to make the house look welcoming for a stranger, when she heard the sound of hooves on the gravel path. She did not look up right away. She told herself she would finish the flowers first, that she would not give whoever this was the satisfaction of her immediate attention. But when the hoofbeats stopped and a voice spoke behind her, low and unfamiliar and entirely unbothered by formality, she turned despite herself. "Those are wilting," the voice said. "You cut them too early in the morning. The stems haven't had time to drink." Evelina straightened, flowers still in hand, and found herself looking at a man she did not recognize, standing near the garden gate with a horse's reins loose in one hand. He was not dressed like the wealthy men who occasionally visited her father, not in the stiff, expensive fabrics that seemed designed to announce a person's worth before they even spoke. His coat was practical, a little worn at the cuffs, the kind of clothing that suggested he worked for what he owned rather than inherited it. "I did not ask for gardening advice," she said. "No," he agreed easily. "You didn't. I offered it anyway, free of charge." Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the anger sitting heavy in her chest since the previous morning, she felt the corner of her mouth twitch, almost a smile, quickly suppressed. "Who are you?" "Callum Rays," he said, and gave a small, unpretentious nod rather than the elaborate bow she was used to from men trying to impress her father. "I'm here about the horses." Of course he was. Everyone who came to this house lately was here about something being sold. "Then the stables are that way," she said, gesturing with the flowers still in her hand, "and I am not part of the inventory you're inspecting." Something shifted in his expression, quick and sharp, like she had said something more interesting than she realized. "I only asked about the horses," he said. "I didn't say anything about inventory." "You didn't have to. Everyone who comes here lately seems to think the same thing, even if they're too polite to say it out loud." He studied her for a moment, longer than was comfortable, longer than strangers usually looked at each other, and she felt oddly exposed under it, though he wasn't looking at her the way most men did, sizing up her appearance, her posture, the things that made a woman marriageable. He looked at her like he was trying to solve something. "What do you want?" he asked. The question landed strangely, because nobody had asked her that in longer than she could remember. Not her father, who only ever told her what was expected. Not the maids, who assumed her wants matched theirs, simple and practical. Not the men who occasionally visited, who wanted things from her but never once wondered what she might want in return. "I don't understand the question," she said, which was almost honest. "It's a simple question," he said. "What do you want? Not what your father wants, not what's expected of you, you." She opened her mouth to answer and found, to her own quiet horror, that she had nothing ready to say. Not because the answer didn't exist, but because she had never once been asked to find it. Years of being told what her role was, what her duties were, what the household required of her, and in all that time, nobody had paused to ask what Evelina Marsh, apart from all of it, actually wanted for herself. "I don't know," she admitted, and it felt strange to say it out loud, stranger still to say it to someone she had met only a minute earlier. "That's all right," Callum said, and there was no judgment in it, no impatience, just a kind of quiet acceptance that surprised her. Most people don't until someone finally asks. He gave a small nod, as if some private matter had been settled, and led his horse toward the stables without another word, leaving Evelina standing in the garden with wilting flowers in her hand and a question in her chest that refused to go quiet. She watched him go, watched the easy way he moved, unhurried, unimpressed by the grandness of the house he was walking toward, and something in her, something that had been clenched tight since she read that advertisement, loosened just slightly. She did not know yet what that loosening meant. She only knew that for the first time in 2 days, she had thought about something other than her own name sitting in a column of things for sale. That evening, her father summoned her to the drawing room, where Callum stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, looking entirely too comfortable for a stranger in an unfamiliar house. "Evelina," her father said, his tone carrying the particular warmth he reserved for moments he wanted to appear generous, "Mr. Reyes has expressed interest in more than the horses." She felt her stomach tighten again, the rope pulling once more, though this time there was something else beneath the dread, something she couldn't quite name. Callum's eyes met hers across the room, and there was nothing in them that matched her father's eager, transactional tone. If anything, there was a kind of quiet apology, as though he understood exactly what was being implied and did not care for it any more than she did. "Is that so?" Evelina said carefully, watching him rather than her father. "I'm interested in staying a few days longer," Callum said, choosing his words with a precision that felt deliberate, "to properly assess the estate, all of it." Her father beamed, clearly hearing what he wanted to hear. Evelina heard something else entirely, something in the careful way Callum had avoided agreeing to anything specific, and she found herself, despite every instinct telling her to be wary of another stranger with unclear intentions, curious about what exactly he meant. The rope around her chest did not loosen completely that night, but for the first time since the advertisement, it did not feel quite as tight either, and she went to bed wondering what it might be like to be asked, truly asked, what she wanted, and to finally have an answer ready when the question came again. The days that followed took on a strange new rhythm, one Evelina had not expected and did not entirely trust. Callum did not behave like the other men who had passed through Ashcombe House in recent months, men who arrived with polite smiles and calculating eyes, who spoke to her father about numbers and to her about nothing at all, as if her presence in a room was simply part of the furniture being appraised. Callum spent his mornings in the stables, as he had claimed he would, running careful hands over the horses, checking their teeth, their gait, their temperament, exactly like a man who genuinely cared about what he was buying rather than one using the excuse to linger near a house with a young woman inside it. But his afternoons were different. She first noticed it on the second day, when she went to the library to return a book she had borrowed weeks earlier, and found him there already, seated near the window with a volume of poetry open on his lap, though he did not appear to be reading it so much as staring past it, toward the grounds outside. "You read poetry," she said, more of an observation than a question, surprised despite herself. "Sometimes," he said, closing the book without marking his place, as though the interruption did not bother him. "Mostly I read it because my mother did, and it makes me think of her." It was such a simple, honest thing to say, offered without hesitation or performance, that Evelina found herself sitting down across from him before she had decided to. "My mother died when I was young," she said, surprising herself with how easily it came out. "I don't remember much about her, just fragments, the way she hummed when she thought no one was listening." "That's not nothing," Callum said. "That's actually quite a lot for a fragment." She looked at him carefully, trying to understand why it felt so easy to talk to a man she had known for only a day, when she struggled to say two honest sentences to people she had known her entire life. "Why are you really here, Mr. Reyes?" "Callum," he corrected gently, "and I told you the horses." "You've inspected the horses thoroughly, from what the stable boy tells me. You don't need 3 more days for that." Something crossed his face then, quick and complicated, gone before she could fully read it. "Maybe I like the company," he said finally, and though it was lightly said, there was a weight underneath it that made her chest tighten in an entirely different way than her father's cruelty had. She did not press further that day, though the question lingered. Over the next several afternoons, a pattern formed between them without either of them quite nomming it. She would find him in the library, or he would find her in the garden, and they would talk, not about the estate, not about the debts, not about the advertisement that had started all of this, but about smaller things. The way she preferred books that made her angry rather than books that made her comfortable. The way he had learned to ride before he had learned to properly write his own name, taught by a father who valued horses more than schooling. The particular shade of gray the sky turned before rain, which she had always found beautiful, and he had always found ominous, and they argued about this with more passion than either of them expected, laughing by the end of it despite themselves. He asked her questions nobody else bothered to ask, not about her prospects or her duties, or what kind of household she might one day manage for a husband, but about what frightened her, what she missed, what she would do with an entire day if nobody expected anything of her at all. "I don't know," she admitted again, the same answer as before, though this time it came with less shame and more genuine curiosity about her own unexplored self. "I've never had a day like that." "Then we'll have to find out together," he said, and though it was said lightly, almost teasingly, something in his tone suggested he meant it more seriously than the words alone carried. It was on the 4th evening that the rupture came, sudden and unannounced, the way real pain always seems to arrive. They were in the stables, checking on one of the mares that had seemed unsettled earlier that day, and as Evelina reached to steady the animal, her hand brushed against Callum's on the rope, an accident, nothing more, but she flinched back so hard she stumbled against the stall door. Callum did not reach for her, did not ask if she was all right in the concerned, hovering way most people did, which she was grateful for, because in that moment any touch at all would have made things worse. "I'm sorry," he said instead, quietly giving her space, his hands raised slightly, palms visible, as though showing her he meant no harm. "It's not you," she said, and her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. "It's not about you at all." She hadn't meant to say more. She hadn't meant to explain herself to anyone, least of all a man she had known less than a week. But something about the stillness of the stable, the smell of hay and horse and evening air, the way he simply waited without pushing, made the words come loose before she could stop them. "There was a man," she said, staring at the ground rather than at him. "Years ago, a friend of my father's. He used to visit often and he was kind to me, or I thought he was kind, and one evening he cornered me in this very stable and put his hands where they didn't belong, and told me if I said anything, my father would not believe me, because men like him were never doubted in houses like ours." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. "I was 15, she continued, her voice steadier now, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I never told anyone, not because I believed he was right, but because some small part of me was afraid he was." Callum was quiet for a long moment, and she braced herself for pity, for the careful, sympathetic tone people used when they didn't know what else to say, the kind of response that made her feel like an object of concern rather than a person who had survived something. Instead, he said simply, "Thank you for telling me." Nothing more. No promises to fix it, no anger performed for her benefit, no attempt to make the moment about his own reaction rather than her experience. Just an acknowledgement, quiet and steady, that what she had shared mattered. Something in her chest, some knot that had been tied since she was 15 years old, loosened just slightly, not undone entirely, not healed in a single conversation, but loosened enough that she could breathe a little easier. "I don't usually tell people that," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I said thank you." They stood there a while longer, not touching, not needing to, the mare shifting quietly in her stall beside them, and Evelina felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Not safety exactly, because safety implied an absence of danger, and the world was still full of danger. Her father's debts, the advertisement, the uncertain future waiting just beyond these walls. But something adjacent to safety. A sense that in this particular moment, with this particular person, she did not have to protect herself quite so carefully. The anger came later that night, after Callum had returned to his room and she had returned to hers, and she lay awake feeling it rise in her chest, sharp and familiar, a sweet, steadying thing she had reached for many times before when the world became too much to feel softly. She was angry at the man from years ago, angry at her father for the version of protection he had never provided, angry at herself for feeling grateful toward a stranger for something as simple as basic decency, as though decency were rare enough to be remarkable rather than expected. But underneath the anger, quieter, was something else, something that felt dangerously close to trust. She did not sleep easily that night either, but for entirely different reasons than the sleepless night before. The following morning she found Callum already awake, sitting on the garden bench with 2 cups of tea, one of which he offered her without a word as she approached. She took it, sat beside him, and for a while neither of them spoke. "I looked through some of your father's papers yesterday," Callum said eventually, his tone careful, measured, as though he were choosing each word with unusual precision, while discussing the horses with his steward. "And the debts are worse than the advertisement suggested, much worse." Evelina felt her stomach tighten, though this particular fear was more familiar than the panic she had felt reading her own name in the papers. "How much worse?" "Worse than horses and furniture can fix," Callum said. "Worse than most single buyers could reasonably settle." "Then why haven't you left?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in a way that made her chest ache with a worry she couldn't quite name. "Because leaving isn't as simple as it used to be," he said finally. "Not anymore." She wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to press him the way he had gently pressed her over the past several days, but something in his tone told her the answer, whatever it was, would not be a simple one, and she was not entirely certain she was ready for whatever complicated truth he was circling. So instead, she drank her tea in silence beside him, watching the morning light stretch slowly across the garden, and told herself that whatever he was avoiding saying, she would find the courage to ask when the time came. She did not yet know how soon that time would arrive, or how much it would cost her to hear the answer. The steward arrived at the breakfast table 3 days later with a letter that changed the shape of everything, though Evelina did not know it yet as she buttered her toast and listened to her father grumble about the price of grain. "A letter for Mr. Ray's," the steward said, setting it beside Callum's plate with the particular formality reserved for correspondence that seemed important. Callum did not open it immediately. He glanced at the seal, and something passed across his face, brief and controlled, that Evelina had come to recognize over the past week as the look he wore when he was calculating how much of himself to reveal. "Trouble?" her father asked, more curious than concerned, the way he approached most things that did not directly threaten his own comfort. "Business," Callum said simply, and slipped the letter into his coat pocket without another word. Evelina watched him for the rest of the meal, noting the way his easy manner had tightened slightly, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the window as though something outside demanded his attention more than the conversation at the table. She said nothing, but she filed the moment away, another small piece of a puzzle she had been quietly assembling since the day he arrived. That afternoon, she found him in the stables again, not tending to the horses this time, but simply standing near the mare's stall, the letter open in his hand, his shoulders set in a way that suggested he had been standing there for some time. "You've been avoiding me," she said, though it was not quite an accusation, more an observation offered gently. "I haven't," he said, though the denial came a beat too slow to be entirely convincing. "Callum." He folded the letter and put it away, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, the way he had looked at her that first day in the garden, like he was solving something, except now it seemed he was deciding rather than assessing. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, "and I don't think you're going to like it." Her chest tightened, the familiar rope pulling once more, though this time the fear was different, sharper, because it was tied to a person she had allowed herself to trust rather than to a stranger's cruelty. "Then tell me," she said. "My father was a merchant," Callum began, his voice steady but careful, like a man walking across unstable ground. "A good one. Honest mostly, though honest men don't always fare well in business dealings with men who aren't. Years ago, he entered into an agreement with your father, a shipping venture. Your father needed capital he didn't have, and my father provided it on the promise of a fair return once the ships came in." Evelina felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she did not yet understand the full shape of what was coming. "The ships came in," Callum continued. "The venture succeeded, and your father, facing his own debts at the time, decided the simplest solution was to claim the venture had failed. He falsified the accounts. My father lost everything he had invested, and more besides, because he had borrowed against his own modest fortune to make the investment in the first place. Within 2 years, he had lost his business, his home, and not long after, his health. He died believing your father, a man of honor who had simply suffered misfortune, alongside him." "And you know otherwise," Evelina said quietly, though it was not really a question. "I found the true accounts 3 years ago, tucked among his old papers. My father never knew he had been cheated. I have known it since, and I have spent those 3 years wondering what I would do with the knowledge if the opportunity ever came to do anything with it at all." The stable seemed very quiet suddenly, the mare shifting restlessly in her stall, as though she too understood the weight settling into the space between them. "So you came here," Evelina said slowly, piecing it together even as the pieces cut at her, "not for the horses, for this." "I came here to see the house that was built on what my father lost," Callum said, and there was no attempt to soften it now, no gentleness left to spare either of them. "I came here to see if the man who ruined him had suffered any consequence at all, or if he had simply gone on living comfortably while my family fell apart. I did not expect to find you." "And what did you plan to do?" she asked, her voice tightening with each word, "once you found whatever it was you were looking for?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. "I don't know anymore. I had thoughts when I arrived, ways to expose him, ways to make him lose what he had gained through my father's ruin. But that was before I met you, before I understood that whatever I did to punish him would also fall on someone who had nothing to do with what he did. So I was simply an inconvenience to your plan," Evelina said, and though she tried to keep her voice level, it cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the hurt she had been trying to hold at bay. "No," Callum said firmly, taking a step toward her before catching himself and stopping, giving her the space she clearly needed. "You were never an inconvenience. You became the reason I couldn't go through with what I originally intended." "How am I supposed to believe that?" she said, "when you've been sitting on this since the day you arrived, letting me talk to you, letting me tell you things I've never told anyone, while all along you were the son of a man my father ruined." "Because it's the truth," Callum said, "even if the truth is complicated and arrived too late to spare either of us this conversation." Evelina turned away from him, pressing her hand against the wooden stall to steady herself, her mind spinning through the past week, searching every conversation, every quiet afternoon in the library, every moment she had allowed herself to trust him, wondering how much of it had been genuine and how much had been calculated, a means to an end she hadn't understood she was part of. "Was any of it real?" she asked, not turning to face him. "The library, the questions you asked me, the night I told you about the stable, about what happened to me here years ago, was any of that real, or was I simply useful?" "All of it was real," Callum said, and his voice broke slightly on the words, the first crack in his composure she had heard since he arrived. "That's the part I didn't expect. I came here prepared to hate everyone in this house, and instead I found someone who understood, better than anyone I've ever met, what it feels like to be worth less to your own family than the debts they owe." She wanted to believe him. Some desperate part of her, the same part that had felt the rope around her chest loosen for the first time in years, wanted nothing more than to believe every word he was saying. But another part of her, older and warier, the part shaped by a father who had never once put her interests above his own convenience, could not simply set aside the fact that he had come to this house with a purpose, and that purpose had involved her family's ruin. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to think away from you, away from all of it." "That's fair," Callum said, and though the words clearly cost him something, he did not argue, did not press her the way lesser men might have, and stepped back to let her leave the stable without another word between them. She spent the remainder of that day alone in her room, curtains drawn, replaying every moment of the past week through this new, unsettling lens. The way he had appeared so conveniently the very day the advertisement ran. The way he had lingered far longer than any horse inspection required. The careful, deliberate way he had drawn her into conversations that revealed so much of herself while revealing comparatively little of his own past, until tonight, until the truth had finally forced its way to the surface. And yet beneath the hurt and the suspicion, there remained something stubborn and quiet that refused to fully condemn him. The way he had said thank you in the stable without pity, without performance. The way he had given her space just now, rather than chasing after her with excuses. The way his voice had broken, however briefly, when he admitted that all of it, the conversations, the questions, the growing closeness between them, had been real despite everything else. She did not know, lying there in the darkening room, whether trust could survive a truth arriving this late, this complicated. She only knew that the ache in her chest was not entirely anger, and that frightened her more than anything her father's debts or advertisements had managed to produce. Downstairs, unknown to her, her father was entertaining an entirely different visitor, a heavy-set man named Edmund Caro, who had arrived that evening expressing serious interest in the full arrangement described in the advertisement, horses, furniture, and the hand of Miss Evelina Marsh included, and who had brought with him enough gold to settle every one of her father's debts in a single transaction, provided the marriage was arranged within the fortnight. Her father, delighted at the prospect of such swift resolution, agreed without hesitation, and without any thought of consulting his daughter on a decision that would determine the entire shape of her future. The papers were drawn up that very night, and by morning, everything Evelina had been quietly wrestling with regarding Callum's confession would be overshadowed entirely by a far more immediate and far more dangerous threat, one that gave her considerably less than a fortnight to decide what she actually wanted, and considerably less freedom to choose it, even if she found the answer in time. Evelina learned of the arrangement the next morning, not from her father directly, but from the same maid who had first read the advertisement aloud, now whispering it to another servant in the hallway outside her door as though it were the most exciting piece of news the household had seen in years. She opened her door before she had fully decided to, catching both women mid-sentence, their faces flushing with the particular guilt of servants caught discussing matters above their station. "What did you say?" Evelina asked, her voice quiet but carrying an edge that made both women straighten immediately. "Nothing, miss," the younger one stammered, but the older maid, the one who had first brought the advertisement, seemed to understand that pretending would only delay an inevitable and painful conversation. "A gentleman came last night," she said carefully. "Mr. Caro, the papers are signed already, miss. The wedding is set for a fortnight from now." The words landed like a physical blow, and Evelina felt the rope around her chest tighten, so suddenly she had to press a hand against the doorframe to keep herself upright. "Signed," she repeated, "without me." "Your father said it was a formality, miss, that the arrangement had already been made through the advertisement, and Mr. Caro was simply the buyer who came forward to settle it." Evelina did not wait to hear anything further. She moved down the hallway with a speed that startled the maids, her nightgown still on, her hair still loose, decorum abandoned entirely in favor of the urgent need to confront her father before this arrangement moved any further beyond her control. She found him in his study again, unsurprisingly, seated behind the same desk, papers spread before him in the satisfied arrangement of a man who believed he had solved a problem rather than caused a devastating one. "You signed papers," she said, not bothering with a greeting without telling me. Her father looked up, and for the briefest moment, something like guilt flickered across his face before it hardened into the same defensive posture she had seen the day she first found the advertisement. "There was nothing to discuss, Evelina. Mr. Caro offered a settlement generous enough to clear every debt threatening this house. I would have been a fool to delay. You signed away my future in a single evening, without a single word to me, and you call that reasonable." "I call it necessary," he said, his voice rising now, matching her own growing intensity. "Do you understand what would have happened if I had waited, if I had allowed you the luxury of deliberation while the house fell apart around us? We would have lost everything, Evelina, everything. At least this way something remains. You will have a home, a husband of means, security beyond anything you would have found waiting for some romantic notion of choice." "I would rather have had the choice," she said, her voice cracking now, all the composure she had tried to maintain since the advertisement first ran finally giving way. "I would rather have had a father who considered me a person worth consulting, rather than an asset to be liquidated the moment a buyer appeared." "You are being unreasonable." "I am being human," she snapped back, "which is apparently more than you are capable of recognizing in me." Her father's expression shifted then, something colder settling into his features, the mask of reluctant necessity dropping away to reveal something closer to the truth of his priorities. "The papers are signed," he said flatly. "The matter is settled. You will marry Mr. Caro in a fortnight, and you will do so with whatever grace you can manage, because the alternative is losing this house entirely. And I will not allow sentiment to destroy what generations before us built." Evelina stood there, chest heaving, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that there would be no reasoning with him, that he had already made his choice long before she woke that morning, and that every word she offered now would simply bounce off the wall he had built around his own convenience. She left the study without another word, her mind spinning, searching desperately for some path forward that did not end in a marriage she had no say in creating. She found Callum in the garden an hour later, still uncertain how to face him after the previous day's revelation, but with no one else in the house she trusted enough to turn to in this particular crisis. He looked up as she approached, and whatever he saw in her expression made him rise immediately from the bench, all the careful distance from yesterday forgotten in the face of clear distress. "What happened?" he asked, no hesitation in his voice now, none of the careful measuring tone he had used the day before. My father has arranged my marriage, she said, the words tumbling out faster than she intended. To a man named Caro. The papers are already signed. The wedding is in a fortnight. Something dark passed across Callum's face, quick and sharp. Signed without your consent. Signed without my knowledge until this morning, she said. He didn't think it necessary to ask. Callum was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight, and she could see him working through something, some calculation she couldn't quite follow. I know the name Caro, he said slowly. Not well, but well enough. He's not a kind man, Evelina. There are stories, quiet ones, the kind that don't make it into advertisements or drawing room conversations, about how he treats those with less power than himself. The words settled over her like a fresh layer of dread, confirming a fear she had not yet allowed herself to fully articulate. Then what am I supposed to do, she said, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, her voice cracked with something closer to despair than anger. The papers are signed. My father has made his choice. I have no money, no family beyond this house, nowhere to go. Callum stepped closer then, close enough that she could see the resolve settling into his features, replacing the uncertainty that had lingered there since yesterday's confession. You have a choice, he said. You've always had a choice. It simply hasn't been offered to you honestly until now. What choice, she said. Tell me, because I cannot see one. Come with me, he said, and the words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. Not as part of some arrangement, not as an asset transferred from one man's ledger to another's. Come with me because you choose to, because for the first time since I met you, someone is actually asking rather than deciding on your behalf. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the calculation she had feared yesterday, any hint that this offer was simply another version of using her for his own purposes. She found none. What she found instead was the same steady patience he had shown her in the stable that night, the same willingness to give her space rather than push, and beneath it, something that looked remarkably like fear, the fear of a man offering something real and uncertain rather than something safe and controlled. Yesterday you told me the truth about why you came here, she said slowly. That some part of your purpose involved my father's ruin. How do I know this isn't simply another version of that plan, taking me away as some final act of revenge against him? You don't know, Callum admitted, and the honesty of it struck her more than any reassurance could have. I can't prove it to you with words alone. All I can offer is this. If revenge were still my purpose, the easiest path would be to let this marriage proceed exactly as your father intends. Let you suffer under a man with a reputation like Caro's. Let your father live with whatever guilt or indifference he manages afterward. That would hurt him far more than anything I could take from him directly. I am not offering you that path. I am offering you a different one that has nothing to do with what your father owes my family and everything to do with what you deserve. The garden was quiet around them, the same garden where they had first spoken, where he had criticized her flowers and asked her a question nobody had thought to ask in years. She thought of the rope around her chest, tightened by an advertisement, tightened further by a signed marriage contract, and wondered if there was a version of her future where that rope simply did not exist at all. If I go with you, she said carefully, and it turns out to be a mistake, I will have given up whatever small security remained to me in this house. That's true, Callum said, not softening the risk, not pretending the choice was simple or without consequence. I won't pretend otherwise. But Evelina, the security you're describing was never really yours to begin with. It belonged to your father, and he has proven repeatedly that he will trade it away whenever it suits him. I cannot offer you certainty. I can only offer you a choice made honestly, between two people who have been honest with each other, even when the honesty was difficult. She looked past him, toward the house that had never once felt like a home in the way homes were supposed to feel, toward the study where her father sat surrounded by papers that had determined her future without her input, and felt something inside her settle, quiet and resolute, in a way it had not settled since she first read her own name printed beside a broken carriage. I need to think, she said, echoing her words from the day before, though this time there was less uncertainty in them and more purpose. But not away from you, with you. I don't have time for solitary deliberation anymore, Callum. The wedding is in a fortnight. Then think here, he said, gesturing to the bench beside him, and I'll wait with you for as long as it takes. She sat, and he sat beside her, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the late afternoon light stretching gold and quiet across the garden. And somewhere inside the house, her father continued arranging her future without any awareness that the daughter he had signed away was, for the first time in her life, quietly deciding to choose something for herself. The fortnight, she realized, was not simply a countdown to a wedding she did not want. It was a window, narrow but real, in which she might still find a way to walk toward something entirely different, provided she found the courage to act before that window closed for good. Edmund Caro arrived at Ashcombe House 6 days before the wedding, ostensibly to discuss final arrangements with her father, though it took Evelina less than an hour in his presence to understand exactly why Callum had warned her about the quiet stories surrounding his name. He was polite in the way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine, his compliments aimed less at her as a person and more at what she represented, a suitable wife to display, a household to manage according to his preferences, an arrangement he had purchased and now intended to collect. When he spoke to her, his eyes lingered a moment too long, assessing rather than seeing, and when she excused herself early from dinner that evening, citing a headache that was only partly a lie, she caught the flicker of irritation crossing his face, quickly smoothed over into practiced patience, the expression of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted and mildly inconvenienced by any delay. She found Callum waiting near the stables afterward, as he had been each evening since her father announced the marriage, and the relief of seeing him after an hour in Caro's presence was sharper than she expected. "He's exactly as bad as you said," she told him, her voice tight with barely restrained disgust. "I'm sorry," Callum said, and he meant it, the simple honesty of the apology settling something in her chest even as the rest of her remained tense with dread. 6 days, Evelina. We need to decide and decide soon." She had spent the past week turning his offer over in her mind, weighing every possible consequence, every risk, every fear that told her trusting a near stranger with her entire future was reckless beyond reason. But she had also spent that week watching her father grow increasingly comfortable in his decision, watching Caro's true nature reveal itself in small, unsettling moments that confirmed everything Callum had warned her about. And somewhere in that process, her uncertainty had slowly transformed into something closer to resolve. "I've decided," she said. "I'm coming with you." Something shifted in Callum's expression, relief and something deeper mixing together, though he did not reach for her, did not celebrate the decision with any grand gesture, simply nodded, steady and serious, as though understanding the weight of what she was choosing. "There's something you should know first," he said, "about what happens after." She waited, bracing herself for another complicated revelation, another layer of truth she would need to absorb before committing fully to this decision. "I don't have wealth to offer you," Callum said, "not the kind why.